Hello, everybody. Good evening. Take your seats. We are fairly booked out, so it's wonderful to have you all here. My name is Jürgen from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, one of the two organizers. It's wonderful to have you all here in this room for the opening session of the Berlin Forum on Global Cooperation 2026. And we are trying something new out in terms of methodology in this Berlin Forum. And this has to do with this QR code you see now displayed. This is called Mentimeter, and it's an instrument for online participation. So if you direct your smartphone on this QR code, it directs you to a website, and the website will have, over the course of the event of the 2 days that we are here, different questions from time to time, and also allows for feedback after the session. So the first question is already here, so you can look at it, and it's an interesting question just for warming up about the future of energy. And yeah, you can keep this while whatever we are just changing the slides and get on. So for the proper welcome, because this was not a welcome, this was just preliminary words, I'm just the master of ceremony, I hand over to Imme Scholz, the co-president of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, and Markus Hanisch, the director of the SLE. So please take the stage.
Good afternoon also from me. This will be a bit complicated to handle both the mic and the papers for my welcome speech, but I'm very happy to see you all here on this nice afternoon. So welcome also from my side to the Berlin Forum on Global Cooperation 2026. We are gathered at a moment that none of us would have wished for, but that all of us must now reckon with, honestly. This is because the past months have changed the global energy landscape in ways that would have seemed implausible at this time last year. The war with Iran, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the price shock that followed, all these events have upended assumptions, they have broken supply chains and forced the world to confront questions that some had hoped to defer for another decade. And yet, from the perspective of energy policy and cooperation, something unexpected has also emerged from this crisis. Because when the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz was cut, the world did not simply wait for it to reopen. What we saw was immediate action. Governments stopped fossil fuel projects and accelerated emergency renewable deployment. Corporations that had been slow-walking their energy transition suddenly found the urgency they had lacked. And citizens also changed their energy-related investment decisions. They installed photovoltaic panels and heat pumps and bought electric vehicles, even here in Germany. So energy security and climate action, so often positioned as competing priorities, revealed themselves to be, as many in this room have long argued, this is not new to you, two sides of the same coin. So the crisis has, in a painful and costly way, made the case that sustainable energy is not an ecological luxury, it is a strategic necessity. So, as I said, this forum has always believed that, but we know belief is not enough. And what this moment demands now is action at a speed and scale that matches the urgency of the situation. And that is precisely what we are here to discuss today and tomorrow. And that's why I also would like to say a word about what happened in Santa Marta in Colombia 3 weeks ago, because it belongs to the center of this conversation. The first conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels, which was co-hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands, it brought together 57 governments representing countries with 30% of global GDP. This conference sent a strong signal. First, it stated the obvious, which was nevertheless a taboo for too long, that climate action will require phasing out both production and consumption of fossil fuels. And second, so this sounds trivial, but it was not stated clearly in that way many times. Or if you remember, the G20 gave itself that objective to phase out fossil fuels, to phase out all subsidies on fossil fuels after the financial crisis in 2008. And practical action never followed up. And this crisis in the Strait of Hormuz showed that this is necessary and mobilized people to act. So it stated the obvious. But second, it also showed that a significant group of countries was no longer willing to wait for consensus, but willing to move forward and cooperate for a just transition. And this conference agreed on 3 work streams to be advanced in subsequent meetings: building national and regional phase-out roadmaps, aligning trade policies with transition goals, and addressing practical implementation barriers, in particular on finance. So these are work streams that were agreed, and obviously they still need to be implemented. But still, it is a good sign. Because there will be a follow-up conference in next year to be co-hosted by Tuvalu and Ireland. So the hard work, above all on financing, which remains the central unresolved challenge, particularly for the Global South, lies ahead. But I think it's important to note and to state that Santa Marta showed that the appetite for genuine partnership is stronger than many had assumed. And it also showed with considerable clarity how much further we still need to go. And for a conference on global cooperation, this is an important step. So now, Markus, join me, please, here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Imme. You've said it all. The geopolitical context we are operating in today could hardly be more sharply defined. We want to talk about different perspectives in this conference. One is, on one side, a strategy of fossil energy dominance, the assertion that oil, gas, and coal are not just energy sources, but instruments of power to be produced, exported, and used as leverage over allies and rivals alike. And on the other, the emerging architectures of sustainable energy cooperation that a recent conference you've just mentioned in Santa Marta has just given new momentum and new institutional form. These are not simply competing energy policies. They are competing visions of how the world organizes itself. Is energy a weapon or an instrument for shared prosperity? Is transition to clean power a threat to manage or an opportunity to share? The closure of the strait and the shock it sent through the world's economies has clarified this choice in ways that years of climate negotiations could not. In the words of the UN climate chief, those who have fought and are literally still fighting to keep the world hooked on fossil fuels are inadvertently supercharging the global renewables boom. Well, the economic case for energy independence through domestic renewables, electrification, and efficiency became undeniably virtual overnight. And we should absolutely not romanticize this crisis. The humanitarian and economic costs continue to be very severe, and they're falling disproportionately on the poorest. But the shift in the political cost of the transformation that has resulted is real. We must take it serious, and we must build on it. Here is what that shift makes possible: a window not unlimited, but genuine, in which the logic of sustainable energy cooperation can advance faster than it could ever before. The question for this forum then is, what do we do with that window? And we believe that to find answers, we have to really tackle 3 areas. The first is partnership that's honest about power. The countries of the global south are increasingly the site of the world's most significant clean energy resources. Solar, wind, geothermal, hydropower, any cooperative framework that asks these countries to forgo fossil development without genuine sharing the economic gains of the clean transition will fail. They must fail. Europe and Germany specifically must be willing to structure partnerships, not just export relationships, around efforts enable local industrialization, local value creation, and technology transfer. Yes, green hydrogen can be a pillar of genuine cooperation, but only if the partnerships are built around commonly shared industrial development and not just shared pipelines. Well, second is our work at home. We have to do our homework at home. The credibility issue. Europe cannot credibly champion sustainable energy cooperation abroad while extending its own fossil infrastructure or softening its former climate commitments. Current and future partners in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, they're all watching what we do. A gap between European climate rhetoric and European climate practice undermines the partnerships we are trying to build. Last but not least, finance. And here we must be blunt. The Santa Marta conference made clear once more that the central unresolved question of energy transition is not technology. It's not missing political will, and it's not the availability of renewable resources, it's money. Who provides it, on what terms, and who bears the risk? These are the central issues. High borrowing costs and limited access to capital continue to block the exit from fossil fuels, even as renewables have become cheaper than fossil these days. The gap between the climate finance the developing world receives and what is actually needed is huge. Closing that gap requires more than pledges at summits and conferences. It requires reforms of the multilateral development banks, guarantees and concessional finance at scale, and a willingness of the part of wealthier nations, including us and Europe, to accept that we can't just wait for the market. The transition cannot be funded on commercial terms alone. If we are serious about that, partnerships, we must be serious about finance and all this, even in a situation where budgetary pressures are big. So thanks all for discussing some of these tough issues today and tomorrow. And with this food for thought, back to Imme.
Okay. Well, I think we are really thinking in similar ways, Markus, because I also wanted to close with the gap between urgency and realism, but okay, I won't repeat what you have already said, because I think everybody is eager to listen to our speakers who are already sitting here. So let me just say that this forum exists precisely to discuss the gap between urgency and realism, the gap between speed at which the energy transition needs to happen and the speed at which institutions, financing systems, political will have been moving. So the speed is different. And that is, how can we change that? That is a question we want to discuss with you here in this forum, together with researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and partners who understand both the complexity of what is required and the urgency with which it must be pursued. And we think the answers need to be pursued in a cooperative, in an equitable way, and with a clear-eyed honesty, as you said, about where we have fallen short. And we believe, and the gathering in Santa Marta confirmed it, that much of the world has made a different choice from the US, which has chosen for fossil energy dominance enforced through market power and political pressure. It wasn't a majority of countries who gathered in Santa Marta, but we know that the majority of countries are interested in cooperating, in sharing resilience over dependency in a future in which the energy transition is not a burden imposed on the vulnerable, but an opportunity built with them. So let's discuss how this can be implemented. And with this outlook on the challenges and opportunities we both mentioned, a heartfelt thanks goes to you, Jürgen, and your team. And your tireless dedication and hard work have made this forum possible. Thank you. And Jürgen, I now invite you to take the floor and walk us through what lies ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ine. Thank you, Markus. Yes, this evening is relatively simple. We'll have two speakers. First, a presentation by Biqing Yang, presenter soonish, and then Jürgen Trittin with his own speech, with a more political take, and then a conversation between Jürgen, Adam, and Jing Wang as a moderator. I'd like to welcome first and ask her to come to the fore Biqing Yang. She is an energy analyst at Amber, a think tank which is famous for its excellent research about global energy affairs. Biqing worked previously with the International Energy Agency, IEA, the British Embassy, Beijing, Conservation International, and the UN Environment Programme, so many important international organizations. So pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. And thank you again to Heinrich-Böll Foundation for inviting Amber to present at this prestigious conference. My name is Biqing Yang. I work on China's energy transition within Amber. So the work that I'm going to present today, the Electrotech Revolution, is beyond my own work. It's really at a global level, and it's the work that is based on research across different teams at Amber. So first of all, a bit more on who we are for those of you that we haven't met yet. Amber is an independent energy think tank. We're based globally, mainly in Europe and in Asia. The way that we work is guided by what we turn data into action. So we collect data, produce open source data sets, and then we present and analyze them to really drive policy changes and actions. So here are a couple of examples of the free open source data sets that might be of interest to our audience today. So you can easily find all of these data sets on our website. I'm going to start by clarifying what do we mean by Electrotech Revolution. There are generally two views currently in the world today on our energy system. One is the incumbent energy view that fossil fuel will continue fueling our economies. The second view is from the climate perspective. This is a perspective that is led by the IPCC, the UN climate negotiations, and the object is to set targets and find pathways that is aligned with reaching net zero globally. And then what we're proposing here is the third pathway, is the Electrotech view. For example, we're using the Rystad data here. It argues that we're shifting to a cleaner energy system that is powered by wind and solar, as well as electrification in our energy system. The transition is therefore more seen as a technological shift. And the driver of the Electrotech view are fundamentally different from also from the climate view. We'll come back to these drivers later in the presentation. So what are Electrotech? Electrotech are technologies around electrons. This include, on one hand, the supply of clean electricity, notably solar and wind, and then on the other hand, the demand of electricity, so the end users. For example, electric vehicles in the transport sector and heat pump in buildings. And then we also have the technologies that connects the two sites together, so grids, software, demand side management, etc. We want to bring in this common term of Electrotech to make it clearer and to best describe the current situation of our energy system. So as we can see on this slide, there are really two dimensions of the Electrotech revolution. One is renewables, and then the second one focuses on electrification. And next, I'm going to cover some of the trends and the evidence for Electrotech revolution. First of all, on technological innovation, here are 3 examples. So without going into the detailed numbers, these show how solar batteries as well as heat pumps keep improving technologically over the past few decades. The next element is very important, is on cost. The fall of cost is really a crucial part that pushed for this revolution. The costs of Electrotech fall by around 20% every time their capacity doubles. So as we can see here on this slide, over the past 10 years, if we look at wind, solar, batteries, I don't think we can see really clearly, but then their costs have fallen into the zones that they can be competitive with their fossil fuel alternatives, the fossil fuel options, only based on cost. So as a result, Electrotech is growing very rapidly. And in terms of electricity generation, this chart shows how today wind and solar combined already have the largest electricity generation capacity globally. We can see that Electrotech takes off at the demand side as well. Electrification has been growing in our buildings and our industries for a century, and now it is taking off in the transport sector with the development of EVs and the technologies along the supply chain. And then the same trends in capacity growth can be seen in these technologies that connects the electricity system together, so batteries, HVDC transmission, internet-connected devices, as well as smart meters. And when we look at the growth of Electrotech by region, it is widely seen that China is moving pretty fast, both in building the wind and solar capacity as well as in electrifying its end users. We're also observing that India is taking a different pathway in developing its economy, which is built on a foundation of the current availability and the affordability of Electrotech. In fact, we're observing a major emerging economy leapfrog in general. If we use the US as a benchmark, we're already seeing many emerging economies deploying more solar in the electricity system and has a higher rate of electrification compared with the US. And then last but not least, the ceiling of the possible of Electrotech keeps rising. This slide shows compares the technological availability of Electrotech in the end-use sectors. In the beginning of this century, in the year 2000, on the left, about a quarter of the end-use demand can be electrified economically. And then whereas now, the proportion has grown to 3/4. So we're starting to transform also some of the so-called hard-to-abate sectors with Electrotech. The next couple of slides, I want to quickly go through some of the global trends in the electricity system. So at Amber, we produce annually a flagship report called the Global Electricity Review. And this chart is our main story this year, that the growth of clean power has met all of the increase in global electricity demand in 2025. And this is largely pushed by the record-breaking growth of solar, as you can see highlighted in the darker green here on the chart. 2025 was also a milestone moment that renewables generated more electricity compared with coal over 100 years. We can see that coal and other fossil fuels has been declining in the last decade, whereas renewables, particularly solar, has been really increasing strongly. And because of the size of China's energy system, a large part of this global story was really driven by the shifting trend in China in the past couple of years. This graph is from our China Energy Transition Review last year. So the data is a little bit outdated, but we're producing a new report which we'll launch in September this year. But this really highlighted also a milestone moment that we can see on the left. China's use of fossil fuel in the final energy consumption has been in a relatively fluctuating plateau phase for the past decade or so, which is driven by a rapid increase of electrification in this energy system. And then when we look at what is used to generate this electricity on the right, we're seeing an early sign of a plateau as well, which is clearly pushed by a rapid uptake of wind and solar. And now I'm going to come back to the drivers of the Electrotech Revolution. So that's the fundamental differences in the drivers compared with the other two energy views that we mentioned at the very beginning. And this will clarify to us why we call this a revolution rather than a short-term trend. The first is on the physics side of things, on efficiency. The fossil fuel system is not an efficient system. It wastes about 2/3 of the primary energy, whereas Electrotech is about 3 times more efficient across the whole system. So wind and solar are 2 to 3 times more efficient than fossil fuel at producing electricity. EVs, they're 3 to 4 times more efficient than ICE cars at powering cars. Heat pumps are 3 to 4 times more efficient than gas boilers at heating buildings. And then for the economics side of things, solar, batteries, EVs, these are manufactured technologies. Therefore, the more we produce them, the cheaper they get. So they have these learning curves, and these learning curves will continue to grow. And this is fundamentally different from the fossil fuels, where the prices do not fall over time. And as a result, we would expect Electrotech to grow more similar to other technologies before it, which is exponentially on S-curve. Entrepreneurs will continue to find ways around the barriers to change, and we expect continued rapid growth for Electrotech. And finally, on a really relevant topic today, energy security. So over 50 countries in the world import more than half of their primary energy as fossil fuels. 3/4 of the world's population live in net fossil fuel importing countries. This is a very high level of risk in a world of rising fragility. On the other hand, as we can see in this graph, every country has enough wind and solar potential to power energy demand with their homegrown energy. And at the same time, proven technologies, Electrotech, can already electrify over 3/4 of the global economy in an economic way. I want to also highlight that the dependency of fossil fuels is different from the so-called dependency on Electrotech. So a solar panel, once we install it, they produce power for 3 decades. They do not have fuel cost. The price do not increase, and there's no supply risk. This is in contrast to fossil fuels, which require continuous import. The current energy crisis is seen as the world's largest disruption of oil supply on record. It is also the second crisis that the world experienced just this decade. So it's right after the 2022 energy crisis due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If we refer back to the last major energy crisis moment in the recent history in the 1970s, there were also 2 crises within 1 decade, in 1973 and 1979. So as indicated in this chart, we call it the twin oil shocks. The 2 oil shocks in the 1970s actually reshaped the energy system at the time. We can see from this chart that until the 1970s, there is a close link between GDP growth as well as energy demand. And after the two oil shocks in the 1970s, fossil fuel demand decoupled relatively from GDP growth, but electricity kept rising. The most powerful response, the most powerful tool that we had at that time in the 1970s was energy efficiency. And this is coupled with more diversified import sources, as well as replacing coal with alternatives like nuclear or coal. But then when we come back to the present day, there's a huge difference in that the solutions that we have at hand now is completely different. Electrotech today is technologically available, they're cheaper and can be deployed rapidly. The other element I want to quickly mention is that different from the crisis in 2022, this current crisis hit the hardest in Asia, which is a rapidly developing continent. So by shaping the energy system in time, the growth and economic prosperity in Asia have the potential to be built based on Electrotech. So I'm going to wrap up here with the key points that we mentioned earlier. The current crisis, as the directors mentioned earlier today, the current crisis has given us another opportunity to adjust our energy system and shift them to Electrotech solutions. So it is now really up to our decision makers and investors to grab these opportunities for the future of our energy system. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Biqing, for this really fascinating presentation. I really love this seeing it again and again. It's a fantastic view. We would like to show you the answers that you put into this Menti tool. Oh, wow, this is really interesting because we can't see the map. We can, there is one. Yeah, that's a problem with the presentation, but we can probably guess how the map looked like. So the 14 is probably China or around China. Then there is in the middle something which could be Europe and Africa, something. Middle East, maybe, yes. And then there is something like, could be North America, South America. We can only guess. So this didn't work as planned. A little glitch, but still interesting. We'll work on this until tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow this will work better. I would like to invite our next speaker to the floor. It's Jürgen Trittin. He's well known in Germany for those online who make attending from. Otherwise, I need still to explain him a little bit. He is one of the founding figures of the West German Greens. He was a member of the Bundestag from 1998 to 2024, so very long time. Federal minister from 1998 to 2005, and in that period responsible for the path-breaking Renewable Energy Act. That was the beginning of, I would say, the German renewables miracle. During his last years in parliament, he was also the spokesperson on foreign policy, so he's not just an environmentalist, he has wide-ranging interests. And we are really very happy to have you with us, Jürgen. The floor is yours.
Dear Imme, dear Biqing, thank you for your fantastic presentation. Dear Jing, dear Jörg, Markus, and Adam. Friends, I should talk about geostrategy. I have to do a first remark. We are experiencing a threefold trend reversal. Today, three long-term developments are coming to an end, and a new reality is challenging us. The first one is, there is no longer a global hegemon. For over 80 years, the world was characterized by two hegemons, first, then only by one. The fall of the Berlin Wall, 5 years ago, marked the end of the one hegemon, the Soviet Union, but it was also the beginning of the end of the other hegemon, the USA. The wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya revealed the US overextension. Today, the US can no longer organize a global order. And under Trump, they didn't want it anymore because the costs are too high. Trump only wants to lead the strongest gang in the world under the law of the jungle. The rise of China, which has gone hand in hand with the political and economic decline of the US, is causing to strive to hegemony. But, however, the world is still a multipolar one in which Europe must rediscover its own role. Second, democratic capitalism is no longer a global model. Combining prosperity and freedom, that is what democratic capitalism stands for 80 years. It was not only in the North. Latin America and South Africa fought their democratic freedom against Europe and the USA. The model of democratic capitalism is eroding. Fascist and autocratic movements and forces are spreading in its core countries. And globally, democratic capitalism is coming under pressure from China. China's authoritarian state capitalism is seen by many societies as the more efficient development model. Third, fossil capitalism is coming to an end. 200 years of industrialization were linked to the use of coal, oil, and gas. The promise of prosperity of democratic capitalism was linked to fossil fuels. Geopolitical power grew out of the possession and the availability of fossil fuels and their prices. This is changing dramatically. On the one hand, the climate crisis resulting from fossil fuels is massively undermining the promise of prosperity. And on the other hand, the global boom in renewables proves that value creation and growth are no longer dependent on coal, oil, and gas. The vulnerability of fossil capitalism is obvious if you look to the Strait of Hormuz. My second thought is that we are confronted with a new polarization, petro versus electrostates. The multipolar world is struggling to find a new order. This is not complete, it's an open battle. The old contrasts between rich and poor, between democracy and autocracy, still remain. However, they are increasingly determined by the new polarization between petro and electrostates, between states producing and exporting fossil fuels and nations that start to rely on electro technologies. The old petrostates, such as Russia, the US, and Gulf states, are confronted with states that are focusing on the electrification of industry, households, transports, and instead of combustion technologies. Electrostates as a model of development, decarbonized industrial societies pose an existential threat to the global power of petrostates. For China, the only question is when it will be free itself from its dependence on fossil fuels, not if. China is now closer to Europe in this respect than the US and Russia. fossil fuels are losing the race. Without repeating Biqing's figures, it is obvious that fossil fuels are losing the race with renewables. Renewables are cheaper and, as predominantly domestic energy, safer and more reliable. This applies not only to the direct electricity generation, it includes also the system costs. In China, as we have seen, a good third of all energy used is renewable. Driven by its EVs, China has become the world's largest car exporter within 5 years. It has overtaken the US, Japan, and Germany. The loss of fossil power is fueling a new, violent imperialism of weakness. Both Russia and the US have realized that they cannot win the economic race with renewables. For Russia, the ability to export fossil fuels is indispensable for the survival of Putin's power. The US sees its role as a global swing producer put into question. Energy dominance is therefore the strategic goal at the center of the current US security strategy. Trump openly states that he is interested in the natural resources in Greenland, Venezuela, or Iran. Both the US and Russia are responding to their economic weakness with authoritarianism at home and aggression abroad. Imperialism out of economic weakness is the fossil power's violent response to their loss of competitiveness. This is a dangerous situation. The Iran war is the fossil Fukushima. With the attack on Iran, Trump has triggered a global energy crisis of historic dimension. The International Energy Agency estimates its impact to be more significant than the crisis in 73 and 79. The crisis is hitting Asia and poorer countries in the global south particularly hard. US oil and gas companies, on the other side, are making massive excess profits. Nevertheless, the US and Trump may become the losers of this crisis. The fuel bills of the voters in the US are rising with the global oil prices. What more? Trump's battle for energy dominance may backfire spectacularly. More and more countries want to free themselves from fossil fuel dependency. For them, the Iran war is the fossil Fukushima. They are focusing on the expansion of renewable energies and accelerate electrification. Unfortunately, under the current government, Germany is bucking this trend and focus on extending the era of combustion engines and gas heating systems, and is cutting down finances internationally for example, climate protection, for combating the climate crisis, but also on investments and energy cooperation. The third main point for me is petro versus electrostates polarize in a multipolar world. Our geostrategic question is, how can the rule of law safeguard it in a multipolar world? Petrostate, and I have to correct myself on that, versus electrostates do not describe a new block confrontation. The world will not become simply bipolar again. A bloc requires homogeneous common interests and a common vision, what we call it in German Leitbild. As well, it needs a hegemon. We find none of this either in the petrostates or in the electrostates. The new order of the world is characterized less by the struggle between democracy and autocracy than by the polarization between petrostates and electrostates. The USA have proven on its attacks on Venezuela and Iran that they are not interested in democracy. Russia has declared its war of aggression against the democracy in Ukraine. Democracy and the market economy are the better prerequisites for the ramp up of renewables. Monopolies, corruption are blocking renewables and electrification. However, the biggest investor in renewables and electrification, China, is in authoritarian state capitalism. The polarization between petro and electrostates affects countries in both the north as in the south. As much as many countries in the global south are suffering from the consequences of the Iran war and their dependence on fossil fuels, there are enough countries in the global south whose elites continue to rely on the returns and power from fossil fuels. India, on the other hand, has decided not to take the fossil fuel diversion in the first class. Access to homegrown renewable energy strengthens the state of the global south. Highly developed industrialized countries such as Japan, South Korea, or Europe, on the other hand, have a massive interest in freeing themselves from their dependence on fossil fuels. They have to assert this against an old ally from whose military protection they benefited from long. Cooperation among electrostates is more similar to the BRICS model than to a new bloc. Energy cooperation between countries in the global south and north is the path for a post-fossil future. Examples can be found in Germany's cooperation with Chile, Namibia, or Canada. Pragmatic cooperation is taking place regardless of differences in other areas. This pragmatism will become the rule in a multipolar world. My fourth point is Europe's sovereignty and competitiveness depend on electricity. Europe has the choice of becoming an electrostate or remaining dependent on fossil fuels. After the second global energy crisis in 5 years, it is time to finally choose the more safer, the cleaner, and the more cheaper, simply better alternative. Climate neutrality creates sovereignty. If the European sovereignty called for by Merz and Macron, I've listened to him and applauded on the Munich Security Conference, Europe's dependence on energy imports must be drastically reduced. By expanding renewables and accelerating electrification, Europe can become the first climate-neutral continent in 2050. A climate-neutral Europe is a geostrategically more sovereign Europe. This is why Trump wants to prevent this by all means. And if you listen seriously to what Marco Rubio said in Munich, he said the same. We don't want European sovereignty. And then our Minister of Defense and our Foreign Minister stand up and applauded him. Germany is putting the brakes on Europe. As in a terrorist war, it is Germany in particular that is anxiously blocking a self-confident European course. The commitment to buy US energy, mainly fracking gas, to the tune of $700 billion is as part of a trade deal where the US get free access to the European market, and the European countries should pay 15 to 50% for their access on the US market. That undermines European sovereignty. It's not only an attack of our climate goals. Gas, and I have to say this also to a former gas manager who's now Minister for Energy, gas is not a transitional technology. It keeps us dependent, extending the era of combustion engines and gas heating systems does not make us more competitive, but keeps our energy costs high. Cheap energy is renewable electricity. Simply that. But you have to invest in it. Resilience costs. Sovereignty pays off. Ending the dependency of fossil fuels is necessary, but not sufficient. Key technologies for renewables and electrification must be available in Europe. Those who do not want to be dependent on Trump and Putin must not be technologically dependent on Xi. The mistake of driving the PV industry out of Europe must not be repeated. We need clear local content rules for the wind industry and battery technology, but also for a ban. We need a ban on inverters from China. In the event of a crisis, security of supply must be guaranteed in Europe. Even as an electrical state, China remains, as the China strategy of Annalena Baerbock described, a partner, competitor, and systemic rival. This also applies to other dependencies. They must be ended. No more Outlook, MS Office and Teams in public services. No more public service on US servers. This all costs money, but it is an investment worth for the event of a crisis. My last remark is the answer to the fossil imperialism is an alliance of middle powers against the fossil warriors. The alliance of middle powers, proposed by Mark Carney from Canada, is not an alliance of electrostates. Canada is a fossil fuel exporter. But nevertheless, Carney is right. If we want to counter the law of the jungle, we have to create and to defend spaces with the rule of law in the multipolar world. That's the core of the alliance of middle powers. And within this alliance, we have to make clear, only together can Europe defend itself. For Trump, Article 5 of NATO treaty is an instrument of blackmail to achieve compliance, no longer a pledge of support. Europe must invest in its own military security, and if it does not want to remain vulnerable to blackmail and counter the threat posed by Putin's imperialism. We need spaces of fair and rule-based trade. We have to overcome the liquidity problem, the access to capital problems for the poorer countries. This includes strategic alliances with Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The linking of economic interests on the other side facilitates the peaceful resolution of conflicts of interest. Electrification and renewables create security and slow down the climate crisis. This must be our answer to the violent end of the fossil age. It is a strategy of peace, security, independence, and development. Thank you.
Thank you, Jürgen. And I have now the pleasure to ask Jing Wang and Adam Tooze to join Jürgen. And yeah, I may present our two new podium guests. Jing Wang is an independent journalist, podcast and social media influencer from China. She is committed to helping the world understand China and China the world. So she writes on her homepage. Jing currently leads the Weirdo podcast, one of China's most popular podcasts. The podcast addresses current affairs inside and outside China from a feminist and progressive angle. She's also an active participant in Chinese debates on social justice, gender equality, and climate. She has 1 million followers on Weibo, China's equivalent to Twitter. So please welcome Jing Wang. And Adam Tooze is probably also very well known to many here in this room. He is a professor of history at Columbia University in New York. He's author of many important books on the economic history of the 20th and 21st century. Among them, maybe most notable, relatively recently crashed on the history of the financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath. We are extremely proud of teaming up with Adam, my colleague Sarah, and myself in our monthly podcast, Märkte, Mächte, Emission, which explores current affairs on the interface of geopolitics, global economics, and the climate crisis. So please consider subscribing this podcast. You find it on every podcast. And Adam, I'm very pleased to have you with us. And you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you for the colleagues at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation to make this happen. So as someone who was born and raised in China, migrated to Europe a decade ago, I really consider this as my second home. So it really feels a huge privilege to be a part of this conversation. And I want to, maybe address a little bit to Biqing's presentation, wonderful presentation. I have to say this is like one of the more promising, optimistic, and very exciting reports that I've heard in recent years. Like, coming from this generation of climate anxiety, your presentation feels very reassuring and even a little bit therapeutic. And then we also have the presentation from Jürgen, which has described the more complicated, comprehensive picture from the geopolitical perspective, which reminds us, this kind of dramatic transition doesn't just happen in a vacuum. I want to maybe direct the first question to Adam, asking for your maybe general response and reflection on the presentation, and then we're going to have a maybe 20 to 30 minutes conversation between these two distinguished guests, and then we're going to open the floor to the audiences, and also both our audiences in the room and also from online. And so Adam, so your work, you have been like a long-term, like dedicated observer of the global climate issue, and I've seen you quoting reports from the Ever team in your chart book, newsletter, in your podcast, in your recently finished book about climate, and you have also been writing sort of extensively on this notion of petrostate and versus electrostate, including your speech at the London Review of Books last year. And so the general question, a simple one to you, is like, what's your take? What does these two reports, these two wonderful presentations leave you?
Thank you. And it is a delight to be here and wonderful to be with old friends, long-standing collaborator of the Böll Foundation, and to be with Jürgen, one of the legends of the German energy transition, is really a particular pleasure. Like Jürg, I love the Ember material, and I can't hear it often enough, because it announces what Jürgen's generation of pioneers and my follower generation were hoping for and have hoped for half a century. I mean, we're not at the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, but one might invoke Hermann Scheer, your collaborator in the great transformative red-green government of the late 90s, who was the prophet of precisely what has arrived at this moment, the possibility of a systematic harvesting of the sun and its power. And as he prophetically announced, if we can crack that, we have the problem cracked. There are hard-to-abate sectors. It'll take time. There's a whole series of follow-on downstream issues we have to address. But we're within striking distance of a solution to a huge part of the problem. We'll then have to all become vegetarians. There's a whole bunch of other things we need to do. But this is profound. And it is incredibly exciting. And Ember, more than any other NGO, has brought us to a realization of just how close we are to the cusp of this. I was meeting with Dave Jones in London just a couple of days ago, and you know, the battery story is the one that's just electrifying right now, right? Because wind and solar are one thing, but we all know intermittency, Dunkelflaute, and now with batteries, we have cheap, affordable batteries, we have the answer. So for me, the drama at this moment is intense because we have no more excuses. The technological obstacle, which was the key argument of conservatives around the world, which was that this is not doable, is now gone. And that, ladies and gentlemen, exposes the politics in a really stark way. So we may come back to kind of wishing we had technological obstacles, because at this point, it just gets dirty. This point, it just becomes, which is where Jürgen comes in, right? It becomes a matter of naked power exercise. It's a dangerous moment in that sense. So both exciting, dangerous. I think the revolution is real. I don't think there's any reason to doubt it. I think we have to take it seriously. We also, and I could see Ember kind of moving around this, we have to reckon with the fact that the dynamic force driving this is China, and not just any old China, but Xi Jinping's China. And I like Jürgen's very sensible list of things that Europe should do and be selective about, the inverters story and so on and so forth. But globally speaking, Europe shouldn't expect everyone to follow that line, right? No. The reality that we're facing is that for the first time in the history of modern industrialism, an Asian country, and not just any Asian country, but China, and not just any kind of China, but CPC-ruled China, is driving a fundamental technological change. So this is Hermann Scheer's revolution, but with a completely different outcome to the Cold War story. And that is a very dramatic situation that we were not historically prepared for. And that, I think, is, for me, the drama. Let me just briefly say something about this Electrotech petrostate thing, because I do have a degree of responsibility for having put it out there in the world. And now I think we kind of need to get the genie back in the bottle, because in some ways it's helpful, and I think in other ways it's quite an unhelpful form of contrast. And let me kind of offer like two takes on this. Well, let me offer kind of a conceptual suggestion and then try and flesh it out. What I find problematic about the electrostate-petrostate distinction is that it becomes reified as a characterization, almost ontologized as a characterization of states. There was a real kicker from calling it the electrostate and the petrostate, but anyone who spent any time with political economy knows that the relationship between political economy, technology, and state form is in fact really complex. And we don't need to get into Marx's state theory here to spell this out, but we just need to recognize that perhaps it might be more useful to talk about the electrotech tendency, the fossil fuel systems of which China is, of course, the biggest, namely coal, and then the petro logic, which runs in a different direction. And we can see those three things, and this really is just elaborating Jürgen's call for more complexity, but running it into this distinction between petrostates and electrostates. Let me make this concrete. Two of the most dedicated, die-in-the-wool petrostates in the world, which are Saudi and Texas, are also leading in green electrification. Because why not? Not everyone can be a petrostate, but everyone can be a clean electrostate. And if you are Texas and Saudi and sit in effectively desert conditions with strong winds, you would be insane not to rapidly diversify your economy and build highly sophisticated downstream industries off the back of that kind of power system. So that's one of the reasons why the electrostate-petrostate distinction could be made into a reality, but it would take political force. As we saw in Texas, there was a knockdown, drag-out fight in Texas politics over the issue of whether Republican ideologues were going to be able to deny red-blooded Texans cheap power for their air conditioners, and the advocates of cheap power for air conditioners won. They don't care whether it's green or not, or whether it's good for the climate. They just want it to be cheap and more robust than their creaky power system. That's kind of one dimension along which this kind of sits oddly. And then let's look a little bit at the notion of petrostates. Because if you're Russia or Saudi, I agree you're in trouble. You have a long-term time horizon that's kind of out there and complicated. But crucially, both Russia and Saudi don't really control their own destiny, because they export 2/3 of what they produce, right? They produce 10 million barrels a day each, and they consume locally. You wouldn't credit it, but Saudi manages to consume 3 million barrels for a population of 35 million. They really burn that stuff. But nevertheless, they profit from exporting the other 7. And they really need to, because their fiscal policy is extremely expensive. But crucially, they don't control their future. So for them, they can build infrastructure, they can try and produce lock-in, they can try and build customer relations, build pipelines, build tanker fleets. But in the end, it's the demand side that will decide their fate. The really terrifying thing about the United States as a petrostate is it is the great exception to that rule. The United States is the world's biggest fossil fuel producer and also the world's biggest fossil fuel consumer. In fact, they're broadly speaking in balance right now. Now, the technical people will tell you the oil types are not the right type of oil and so on and so forth, but that's small details on the general picture, which is the horrifying possibility that if America chose, it could simply lock itself in and make a fossil future on its own terms. And so, to my mind, the crucial battle, and it's one that needs to be had out in the US, and I speak now as an adopted American citizen with a degree of passion about this, is that it hurts me to hear brilliant European politicians and activists just ontologizing America as petrostate. A huge fight is on in the United States over the future of our country. Let me say it, our country. And the amazing thing is that the most powerful, forward-looking dynamic frontier of American capitalism right now is what? It's electrotech, through and to the core, because it's AI. And they're going to invest $700 to $800 billion this year in compute. And what does compute run on? It doesn't run on oil. It doesn't run on gas. It runs on electricity, for goddamn it. Right? And so the astonishing thing about the American situation right now is that we have a pure reactionary politics that is standing in the way of America's own electrotech revolution. And from the point of view of critical Marxist state theory, it is one of the great tests of our explanatory power, whether that can really persist. Because otherwise you would be expecting big tech, the biggest companies the world has ever seen, the richest men, and they're all men that the world has ever seen, to prevail in forcing over the long run a strategy of green electrification in the United States as well. Because as much as they may want to use gas turbines, they just can't get them. The pipeline of supply, the backlog of gas turbines stretches into the early 2030s. If you actually want to build huge amounts of dispatchable power right now for your data centers, it has to be solar with battery backup. And that's what we're actually seeing in Texas. That's what we're actually seeing in California. And so to that extent, I think analytically, also in terms of the global struggle, we should keep these categories open.
Thank you for the reflections. I want to then turn the question to Jürgen. First and foremost, we'll be curious if you have any response to Adam's elaborated description of this notion of petrostate and electrostate. And secondly, I noticed you ended your talk with this very powerful line, the violent end of the fossil age. And I think both Biqing and Adam have been talking very passionately about the revolution. The revolution is here, the technology is available, and the cost is low enough. So on the one hand, we do feel that the revolution is here, the revolution has arrived. I want to ask you more explicitly, do you agree that the revolution has arrived? And if yes, what do we do with this revolution, with the momentum that the revolution has arrived and it is here?
The experience from the German energy transition was not that we had the better technology. The idea was to make these technologies competitive. And we made it really cheap. And therefore, what the technological side and even what the economic side is going on, I'm very optimistic on that. I see very clearly Trump prohibits offshore wind parks. He pays $1 billion to Total Energy not to build a wind park.
Not to finish it.
Yeah, not to finish it.
Two-thirds built
It's really an ideological driven politics. And the reason why I said I corrected myself was that the simple thinking of a state as an electrostate sui generis, by nature, but no. It is a more or less political decision and a question.
Maybe away from your mouth a bit. Or maybe the mic. Maybe that can't help, can it, if you've also got that.
And a question of the political forces and strategies. And if you say, on the example of Saudi Arabia or even Russia, what is the question of demand? Russia tries to blackmail others to stay in the dependence. Yeah. And they do it with military means. And this is the same if I look what's happening by the US. You have seen this unfair LNG treaties with Eastern Europe countries. It's not only on the military way. They create a demand to survive the fossil industry by military means. And that is the geostrategic aspect of the confrontation of electrostates and petrostates. And that was the reason why I said you have to differ between alliances of electrostates and alliances of middle powers. Because in these middle powers you find a lot, perhaps Brazil, they are a fossil fuel producing country. You see countries like Chile, a lot of lithium, a lot of wind and solar, but no fossil fuels. You see Canada. So the political answer from my side is not to be blocked in this confrontation between petro and electrostates, but to have clear that we have one, as Germany and Europe special, problem that we have our biggest ally for over 80 years is trying to blackmail us to stay in a fossil future. So that is our problem. So to overcome this, and if you see how the German government behaved, I have always the impression they are not brave.
They're not brave.
No, not brave, because they are cowards. They say, oh, we can't defend ourselves, where we should get our energy from. This is the problem. We have to confront them.
Couldn't I? I mean, one of the things that really struck me about your talk was that you postulated sovereignty as something self-evidently desirable. Whereas we both know, growing up in West Germany, that that's absolutely not something one can take for granted. Rather the opposite, right? The condition of West Germany's reconstruction after 1949 was precisely the voiding of that question. And it does strike me, and this is also one of the reasons why, say, figures like Henry Kissinger were always somewhat suspicious of the autonomy of West German politics, including Ostpolitik, because they saw in that a German nationalism that ultimately was a dangerous strain, and they were afraid of that coming back.
But Adam, I defined sovereignty as a European sovereignty.
I'm not accusing you of it. I'm just saying it's not
different
hard to explain why Merz is a coward.
And we should do it. And I said, Merz was right to demand on sovereignty. The bitter truth for Germany is that their old economic model is no longer working. Getting cheap gas from Russia, producing high-tech machinery and cars, and selling them on open markets in regulated trade. This is over. That's the reality we are confronted with, and they are not brave enough to look on this reality and try duck and cover.
Yeah, let's talk about China. China has appeared in multiple occasions today in the presentation and the speech and the remarks. And I know, Jürgen has described this whole complexity of working with China, dealing with China, and then Adam made it a little more explicit. It is not just China, it's China. And so I wonder, like, the question to both of you, like Adam as a historian, put on your historian hat, how would you describe this kind of historic moment that we're in right now with the advanced technology from China and also with the inevitable complexity of dealing with China in its current version, and also to Jürgen, as a long-term politician, you have been taking a pragmatic approach in very complicated situation. And what do you think? What do you think if we want to, like in Europe, reach a deal with China? What could possibly be the terms?
In 2005, we did the second conference on renewable energies in Beijing. It was my decision to go there. I wanted to convince them on the efforts and advantages of renewable energies. We succeeded on that.
Brilliant.
But I'm not naive. I see that we now have the China from 2004 is not the China from 2026. It has changed. And the China for 2026 is striving to become a hegemon on the Electrotech technologies. That is very simple. They reached this on the PV production. They are on the way in the batteries. If I look on the wind industry, the 5 largest Chinese companies, each of them is bigger than all European wind industry companies together. Yeah. That's the reality in the world. That is the reason why I said we have to create answers to the challenge from China. Despite the fact I said in the case of energy, it's closer to us than the US and China, than the US and Russia. Because this is also in the sense, in the interest of the global South. It's simply like in aviation. If you would have only Boeing, it will be a problem. So you can change between Boeing and Airbus. And that is the reason why I think it is the responsibility for Europe, not only in its own interest, but also in global interest, to protect the wind industry, to protect inverter production in Europe, and to have a profound industry on batteries. That's my main argument, not to be naive on that, because China is an electrostate and we are an electrostate, so we are friends. No. Partners, competitors means we are sometimes cooperative, but competitors we see very clearly if the competitor is unfair.
Watching you speak earlier and knowing a little bit about your biography, I actually wanted to turn interviewer rather than answer the question because, it's part of my answer. So when I look at China, I think, to go to Qing's point, the two moments in history that immediately come to mind are the question of Ostpolitik in Germany, the question of how West Germany moved towards the East and attempted to maneuver its way out of the impasse of the Cold War that was so painful for this city that this part of Berlin was once on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the building that we're in and the space that we're in right now. And that took moral courage, it took tact, it took tactics, it took some very brave democratic politics in the early 1970s, it took Willy Brandt, Mehr Demokratie wagen, and a whole combination of other things. It vectored out of '68. In a very interesting way. The other moment that comes to my mind as a student of the interwar period with a family history of communism is Stalinism and the moment of the 1930s and the Popular Front where progressives and radicals around the world decided that the fight against fascism required in many cases some kind of tactical alliance with their local communist parties, and ultimately, of course, it was the Grand Strategic Alliance, both with China, the Republican Chinese, and with the Stalinist Soviet Union that liberated this city, and let's call it that, in the spring of 1945. And that, to me, is the weight of our current moment. That this isn't just a technical matter, it's not just a matter of WTO conformity, it's a matter of historic transition. And we have to reckon, as progressives in the West, with our own history, including those two moments of history, with the dominance, we have to say it, and the leadership of a society ruled by Xi Jinping, who himself, of course, makes no secret of the fact that he insists on the lineage that runs from Lenin to Stalin, underline Stalin, and from there to Mao and forward, right? Historical nihilism, the great sin that Xi Jinping is determined to extirpate, is the refusal to own the violence of Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. That is the one thing that you must not give up. You must not give up your loyalty. And there's a question that comes to my mind when I meet somebody like you from the generation of German leftists that you came out of, that China has been with you, suddenly struck me, all your political life. It was there in the Cultural Revolution of the late 1960s and in the politics of the German K-Gruppen in the 1970s. It was there as you met 1989 and the rise of the Green Party, which comes to national prominence in the late 80s. It's there when you're in government and you're negotiating these phenomenally important deals in the history of the Chinese renewable energy industry. This is no joke. 2005 is a big deal for the Chinese government at that moment. And then you see in the 2010s and the 2020s this thing, which is the descendant of the politics of the 60s and 70s, Xi Jinping on the other side of the Cultural Revolution from Western fellow travelers. It just strikes me that this is within your own party, Bütikofer and people like that, of course, also have a similar history like that, and he's ended up sanctioned by the Chinese regime for the positions he takes in the European Parliament. And so I'm just kind of, I suddenly realized this Green Party in China, this isn't a new thing for you. That's a problem. This is not, ihr seid kein unbeschriebenes Blatt, right? You have history here.
Yeah, we have history.
And I'm kind of curious to know how you that's great. I'm just kind of curious how you, as one strand in the Green Party's history, process that trajectory, because it's fascinating, and it has no analog in the US. None whatsoever. There's no one in American politics at your position that has anything like that kind of trajectory.
My personal first clash with China was as Vietnam invaded Cambodia. And when we had within the German left a long discussion whether we should respect the national sovereignty of Cambodia or defend the human rights of those who has been murdered in Cambodia. We decided on our side, we are on the side of the human rights in that, and China attacked Vietnam for that and lost the war. The last war Vietnam won was the war against China.
Yeah, the last war China lost against Vietnam.
So this is a little bit from my use and my vita here coming. But for a long time, even in Germany, it was consensus between nearly every democratic party that if we go on cooperating with China, there will be a development in the right direction of the rule of law and perhaps also democracy. And this was naive and wrong. And it is one of the things Annalena stood for, that we have rewritten the German-China strategy, and I quoted the core sentence from that, because inside China, there has been a dramatic shift. In China, they are very open. They say, Mao liberated us, Deng make us rich, Xi will make us great. So that's the sentence, and everyone who do not want to see this is naive. And that's the reason why I think, okay, we have to cooperate. We have good cooperation in the field of climate protection. Jennifer, we see her here tomorrow, has been often there with the chief negotiator of China. That was good for that. But we don't have to see, or we have to see that this China is an authoritarian state and is a state who strives to become a new hegemon, and the technology question is one of the instruments for this hegemony. And that's the reason why I'm fighting for a sovereign Europe that protects its industry and goes in this, or counters this challenge.
And it's your technology.
Yeah.
The Greens technology, the deepest, your baby.
But it has been sold by liberals and conservatives to China.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for the remarks on China. And of course, this is like our Berlin Global Forum. We don't want to dominate the discussion with the China question. But we are running a little bit out of time. So I will pose my own questions and start asking for some questions from the audiences. And if you have a question, please stand behind those microphones. We have 2 microphones on both sides. So please come and prepare your question. And also for our participants online, yeah, get ready with your question. We're gonna go there later on. So yeah, feel free, this lady.
My name is Eva Kustrup. I'm a real founder of the Greens in the year 1979, and we did it in the year 79 as answer to the first energy crisis I lived in 1973. So there is a long history of not just of political visions, but of technological knowledge and pragmatic political knowledge since at least 1979 with the European Greens. We started on European level, and as Jürgen said, right, we want European sovereignty, we do not want to go back to nationalism. But as we started as feminists, Petra Kelly and me, at least, and some other women founding the Greens, I want to make a remark. I find it very strange when now Hermann Scheer is the big prophet, and when now the solar and renewable energies are the baby of Jürgen. If I would be a professor for feminist studies, I could give you a talk of 5 hours about that mistake. And Adam, my name is Eva, we should have a little... So there have been at least, I know Jennifer Morgan since she was a young women activist from Greenpeace. So that's at least 30 of 35 years of cooperation of women on international level. And it has been women in Vermont and California in 1977 who started solar and wind energy. So I agree with Adam in the term that there is another US and another US history against the petro-state and petro-militarism. I liked very much the very clear talk of Jürgen in that. But if you make it a history of famous men and famous ministers, I think it's not only a fallback for the reality, it's especially in the situation we are with Putin, Xi Jinping, and Trump. It's a big political mistake because all the three dictators and behind the fossil other states like Iran or Saudis, they are doing the rollback for feminism. And I think there is a deep link in between fossil dictatorships, fossil, economy, and not accepting the care work and the intelligence and the role of women we have to give them and to fight for them in society. So my practical question beside that talk of at least 30 hours at a university you should listen to is, what about lithium? So Jürgen, you said we work together with the middle powers. What is a middle power? I worked in the 80s on the middle power initiatives against nuclear weapons. So what is a middle power initiative now related to lithium? And that means Chile, Serbia, Erzgebirge, because you said you want to have a space of states of Rechtsstaat. How did you?
Rule of law.
Yeah, rule of law. How do you continue with the rule of law and cooperation with the middle powers related to the lithium and other things you need for batteries and renewable energies?
And also at the same time, if you have a question, please stand behind the microphone. Yeah, Jürgen.
You are right when in describing the history. I've never done this described as you described it on that. But in the lithium question, we will have tomorrow a discussion with President Boric. And this is part of the answers. The other part is that we need more ideas, and that means not ideas, market conditions for enhancing recycling and circular economy. For a long time, there was a debate not only on lithium, but also on permanent magnets. Now, the industry, after it fell short, has built up structures of recycling for that. So our dependence on the monopoly of China to permanent magnets is decreasing. So that is one of the answers I would give on that. Fair cooperation agreements that includes not only the resources, but building up chains of value, and also strengthening the conditions for recycling and cycling economy.
Do you want to also address a little bit? Sure. Yeah.
I mean, your point is very well taken. And would you agree that the Green New Deal proposals in 2018, 2019, which had a huge element of feminist care economics, were both a demonstration of that other America and its possibilities, but then also a sad demonstration of the way in which that kind of vision was very easily sacrificed in the bargaining processes in Congress in 21-22, out of which the Inflation Reduction Act emerged, which was a hard hat industrial policy centered on productivism rather than the much broader agenda of care economics, which the explicitly feminist-inspired vision of the Green New Deal had outlined. That would seem to me a moment which confirms your sense that this is always also, not even also, simultaneously and powerfully an issue of gender, and it's that they're the different visions of economic development associated with more masculinist, more feminist perspectives. We're good there? Okay, we're good.
So just to forecast about the conference a little bit, actually tomorrow I and Jennifer and Adriana is going to do another panel, which is the final panel of the conference, addressing particularly about the gender and climate issue. So you should all come tomorrow. Hope to see you all tomorrow. And let's get the next question. And after this question, we're probably going to turn one question online. And so, yeah.
I wanted to bring it back to China and the EU because we talked so much about it. And there, I think, within the critical macrofinance field and talking about like financing the transition, I think we talked so much about these two countries that I always wondered, China is the big green state, is the ideal type of disciplining capital as well, where the EU is the weak de-risking state and is like not managing to discipline capital in the same sense that China does. And I've been wondering the whole time, what do you see as the possible trajectory for Europe to go forward if it either decides not to discipline capital at all, and like how do they get the finance actually in the sectors that are necessary for the transition and not those that just bring the most profit? And it was mainly for you, Professor Tooze, and I was wondering how you would maybe respond to the critique there.
So our friend here is invoking work by Daniela Gabor and Benjamin Brown. Daniela, in her own right, a kind of macro-financial feminist, arguing that the critical issue here is the capacity of governments to mobilize huge amounts of credit, which is a sticking point for Germany and Europe, obviously, and the constant refusal recently reiterated, I gather, as last couple of days by Merz, there will be no common debt. No repetition of next-gen EU. On the one hand, this is the one deficit, and the other, as you say, is the willingness of the EU to not just offer carrots, not just offer inducements, not just offer incentives, but actually to use the coercive force of the government. And this is where the question, obviously, of CPC governance in China really, this is where it gets hard. Because the fundamental question is, how can a democratic politics, generate the majorities necessary to sustain tough bargains? And obviously, the Kohler Kompromiss in Germany of the late 2010s is a case of failure in this regard. Relatively small interests bought off at incredible expense with largely unsatisfactory climate outcomes. There's little reason, in short, to be optimistic on this score, and it's one of the fundamental reasons why China has the dynamism that it does. I agree that one could add various elements of compromise into this deal, but until you can actually beat the German car industry into saving itself, you're in trouble.
Thank you. So let Sarah.
So can you hear me? I think now it should work. Yeah. So there were several questions. Maybe let me choose two. So one that I found very interesting was someone that wrote, historically, energy transitions reshape the geography of production. Do you think that the current green transition will decentralize economic activity or deepen existing core periphery structures? Then there was another question touching on the issue of justice, which I think is also a very important one, because we have talked a lot about the energy crisis that we are suffering from, but there's also a global inequality crisis. And the question is, how can the clean tech revolution become a tool for energy justice rather than a new source of global inequality? And last but not least, there was the wish from the online audience to talk a bit more about the role of nuclear power, which hasn't been mentioned yet. Not sure if we will go there, but just bring
it. I guess the question is to both of our panelists. So do you want to each address a little bit?
I'm sure we agree we shouldn't waste any time on nuclear power. To my mind, the dangers of a polarizing technological development are obvious from the new clean tech. And in some senses, China's advantage is already so manifest. But on the other hand, we just simply can't ignore, and this is the Ember message over and over again, that this is unprecedentedly cheap technology for mass electrification. And the single standout example is Pakistan, in many people's eyes, the weakest and most fragile state in the world. Very poor, unlike India, not a development success story. As a result of that, a malfunctioning electricity system. According to the latest numbers, 50 gigawatts of Chinese solar imports in the last 5 years. That's 1/5 of the German electricity system, imported for $17 billion, almost entirely without aid, driven essentially by the Pakistani upper middle class doing its own green 2000-style Energiewende, building out. Now, that has huge problems for the Pakistani grid, which is now in crisis, but nevertheless, it's a demonstration of how rapidly and powerfully this can move. So reasons for optimism, I think, on that score. Huge projects being launched by the African Development Bank to bring cheap renewable energy to 300 million. That's half the Africans without electricity supply. They don't even mention the fact the solar panels are all from China. So they're burying that as deep as they can. But China's setting the bar and driving that cost down, and it's got to be good news.
And especially for the question of justice. Access to energy is a prerequisite for economic growth. And to overcome this, there is no cheaper way than to do it with renewables. And the problem that Markus was offering us is to overcome the financing question. This financing is not a question of aid. It's a question of access to capital. If you get access to capital, you will be competitive. And that is the responsibility, and that is the reason why I criticized our government of cutting the funding for such transformation projects that is officially development aid, but it's not aid. It's a question of opening the opportunities for other countries to bring people out of poverty.
Thank you. So how about we collect the two questions together? Yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks for giving me an in, actually, because I wanted to bring up the case of Pakistan, where I'm originally from. For the past year and a half, we have been working with the Green Party's Bear Bilhon as the lead of my project on getting parliamentarians, legislators in Pakistan to improve policies to improve the uptake of renewables in Pakistan. And as we know now, at this point, 33% of the grid is powered by solar in Pakistan, and the solar is mostly imported from China. This has kind of really insulated the country from the shock followed by the crisis with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But initially, the parliamentarians were kind of going back and forward. They were kind of trying to protect the grid, trying to protect legacy contracts. What we have seen following this crisis is that they want to have more solar in the grid. They want to have more renewables. And this is sometimes maybe war can be a window of opportunity as well. And it also means that, part dependency does not have to be the option. So what, be it on war, be it on power, grid matrices. So what are your, I think, thoughts on part dependencies?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Nora Sausmikal from Urgewald, and Ember probably knows Urgewald. We are using to say we are data-driven activism based also on Rystad data. And so I have a twofold question. One is concerning China and the data on China, because yes, and I think it was mentioned in this round, there's a revolution going on, and we all profit from that. The decentralized Pakistan solar revolution is an proof of that. But at the same time, China is still expanding its fossil investments around the world and inside. So according to our data, it's on the second position when it comes to coal to chemicals expansion. So new. So I think it's too early to to celebrate, and China is also part of what's going on, described by Jürgen in the geopolitical game. So it's very pragmatic. So it's a parallel development we witness. And the second one is concerning finances, because I'm personally work on MDBs, so multilateral development banks, and it was mentioned in the introduction that the key is finances. And multilateral development banks could be a solution, but they are owned by states, by China, by US, and so on. So, and what we witnessed just now is that, first of all, they do not divest from fossils. Secondly, they open the door, and sorry to tackle that question again, to nuclear. And this is what's coming, and this is why we really this year focus on trying to stop the multilateral development banks investing or open the door to nuclear. It will come, nevertheless, and Russia and China will be the ones geopolitically profiting from that. And yeah, these are my two questions.
That gives Jürgen the last word. I think path dependency is a really crucial issue in many of the conversations that we have with Böll around global energy transition stories. It does seem to me that one size fits all is just not a viable way of thinking about this problem. And so we have to distinguish between states with very minimal electrification, much of sub-Saharan Africa, where it's a straight swap, it's a build out, it's unambiguously win-win-win-win-win. The faster you go, the better. And states like Pakistan, which have overextended fossil infrastructure, or South Africa, which have overextended fossil infrastructure, where there's really deep energy transition issues and really painful trade-offs. And they need different types of assistance to do that. JET-P was an effort to try and build that. That was the kind of targeted support given to Indonesia, given to South Africa, to try and address the coal compromise kind of problems of how you deal with for fossil fuel workers. So I think that's a point very well taken, and breaking path dependency is the name of the game here. That then also, in a sense, allows me a transition to China, which is, though it doesn't have, well, that's not true. China actually has a long history of coal and fossil fuel development that goes back to the early 20th century, but it's escalated on a pace that no one has ever escalated before. And they are trying to turn, we used to talk about, I think it was Peter Goltz, trying to turn a supertanker. This isn't trying to turn a supertanker. This is like trying to turn a herd of 747 aircraft all simultaneously taking up at once and then deciding not to. Like, the dynamism of this is just absolutely spectacular. So it's not surprising to me that they go on building out, right? And we know their logics. They build coal. The one thing they don't build is gas. They don't build nuclear in combination with other things much, but they do coal, wind, solar, and batteries all together, and they basically reckon on coal doing about 20% of the base load, and it's kind of a concession to a legacy technology, and we think we should trust the Ember numbers. They are slowly turning the corner. I completely agree that heavy chemistry is a nightmare problem in China, and it's one area they don't already dominate, and they are going hard down that line. So of course that reality's, of course that's the realities there. The multilateral development banks are just the more you look at them, the more insane it is. Because not only are they owned, it's this amazing thing. They're both owned by governments and intensely protective of their AAA credit rating. Think about that for a second. I mean, that is like the height of madness. So you, A, allow yourself to be constrained by the most conservative veto player, which is in Congress. And it's basically Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz that is calling the shots there. And then you allow yourself to be constrained by the most hawkish ratings agency that will or will not give you a AAA rating. And you say, we've got to do both these things, because otherwise we lose our precious ability to subsidize, which is, ladies and gentlemen, down to the governments that own the banks. So they play this utterly bizarre kind of game, which with a net result that they can do far less than they ought to be able to do. So it's a zone of action, but with the current American administration and with their veto blocking power, it all goes around the side of them right now. It doesn't go through them.
Do you want to give some final?
I agree what Adam said and don't want to repeat it. 2 remarks. One is, you should not overestimate governments. As I was 3-4 years ago in India, at that time, India in the international climate negotiation defends the role of coal. Yeah. At the same time, in India, there was not a decrease of investment, it was a divestment of private investments in any form of coal, because the renewables were so cheap. And that is the lecture, I think, and I hope, if you are right, Trump is facing now. And the last remark, sorry for that, is on nuclear. Look, from the primary energy demand of the world, they deliver less than 5% since years. But we have a debate in Europe that is more than 50% on that. No, it's not 50%. It's less than 5%. And if I look on the simply costs per kilowatt hour, it's not my fantasy. It's the contract for difference in UK that starts with 15 cents per kilowatt hour and has an inflation that will bring up over the time up to more than 30 cents per kilowatt hour. And now we see globally for wind onshore, for PV, less than 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So, okay, be in favor of nuclear, but find someone who will finance it. And the third thing is, if you have a system that has a dominance of renewables, even France will come to a situation where they see the incompatibility of base load systems with renewable systems. This is not, some people believe that it's wrong, but they believe in it, it's all CO2 free, nuclear and renewables. But they don't see the systemic conflict within a grid, an energy system, between a baseload system and a system that is dominated by cheap, volatile baseload, and that is the renewables. And therefore, I'm back to Adam, let's not talk about nuclear, it has no future.
Okay, thank you both. That was a wonderful conversation. And just to remind everyone, this is just the opening panel of the this year's Berlin Forum on Global Cooperation. And we are just so many more issues tomorrow. And please join me for a round of applause for our wonderful panelists and also for the Heinrich-Böll Foundation team to make it happen. Thank you.